Awesome. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to hang out and listen to us talk about writing stuff. My name is Happy by 3. I will be kind of splitting moderation duties for this panel with JPEG over on the other end. And I'm going to go to this slide real quick, and we can just introduce ourselves one by one. We can just go in order. If, Jay, you want to start.
Hi, I am JPEG. So I am on this panel / moderator by virtue of this is what I do in my regular job. Not I haven't written speedrun guides, but I'm an instructional designer. So I make a lot of instruction videos, instruction PDFs, that sort of thing. And also, as a speedrunning neophyte, I am the person that is reading their guides and trying their best. So it makes me uniquely equipped to have strong opinions on something that I'm not currently doing, but I get to moderate, and that's great.
Hi, I'm Quacksilver. By day, I am a theater writer and educator, and by internet, I am an indie game multi-runner and guide author for a lot of silly little indie games, and building smaller communities into something wonderful is a passion of mine, and I'm very excited to talk to you all.
Yeah, I'm dangerous. I thought this was the line for the buffet, whereas anyways, I am a college instructor by day of communication studies, so I have a lot of experience teaching people things, and I've been in speedrunning for, I'm going to date myself, 6 years, I think? A long time, and I have done guides for multiple games and leaderboard moderation for many more.
Hi, again, I'm Happy by 3. I am a technical writer in my day job, so I also kind of create route guides for work, and a former college communications professor. And to date myself worse than Dane, my first speedrun was in 2014. Yes, so I'm very old. And yeah, I've written guides for a little indie JRPG called Ickenfell, working on a guide for Turnip Boy Robs a Bank, done a couple other guides for games I play. And I'm super passionate about making speedruns more accessible to new community members, which I assume most of y'all are too, because you're here. So quick overview of just the order we're going to go through things. We're going to talk about kind of the value of making resources for your community. Like, what do you gain? What does your community gain? Why is it worth taking the time to do this thing? Because it is kind of time intensive. And then talk about some different types of resources you can make, why you might make those types versus others depending on your game's needs. Some general tips for creation, a little more in-depth discussion of identifying what is necessary for your game, looking at a couple examples of really good guides out there, and then a Q&A segment if anyone has any questions. And our estimate is about an hour.
I have to compliment you on the fact that the attempt counter is 0 for this. That's a nice touch.
Zero attempts.
Zero attempts.
All right. So first thing, the value of creating quality resources. Something Quack brought up was the value to them of creating communities. So Quack, if you want to...
Yeah, I think I speak for a lot of speedrunners when I say the most potentially damaging thing to building a speedrunning community is when a new runner joins and their first instructions are to scroll up in the Discord.
Yep.
When resources get incredibly centralized in places that are very inaccessible on the internet, whether through technical barriers or just through social barriers of coming into an unfamiliar space, it leads to a lot of very quick burnout from new runners in the community. So being able to create and populate across multiple spaces a guide, something accessible that new runners can click on and understand in their own time and potentially with their own group of people is hugely valuable for not just getting them into your community, but also keeping them there.
Yeah, agreed. And one of the big issues with having like a Discord and having all your resources centralized there is Discord is incredibly bad for compiling and synthesizing multiple resources for route development and for onboarding new runners. And so if you can find another way to centralize resources, you will make it much easier for new runners to come in and build said community.
Yeah, for sure. And I think some people, this is honestly something that kind of surprised me at first when we were having this discussion, because some people like me are like, yeah, I'll just click the Discord join link and go bother people in the speedrunning channel. But that's not comfortable for everybody, and it's not like familiar to everybody. So having options is very, very important to like. Some people will be more comfortable just downloading a PDF from SRC and reading it, and some people want to jump in the Discord and ask all their questions and get feedback. And like having the ability to do both of those things means every person who expresses interest in a game will have the chance to get into that game. Because I'm sure, I mean, it's only day three?
Three.
Day 3. It's only day 3, and I've already had several people mention like, oh man, I meant to learn that game, but this happened, and then I just never did, right? So like, most of us have done that or seen someone do that, so we all kind of know there is a break point in the experience of like, I want to learn this game, I took the first step, and more often than not, if that first step doesn't work, people are just like, I'll learn a different game, right? Like, that happens a lot. So if we want to build our communities, one of the best things we can do is make sure that first barrier to entry is as smooth as possible for every person who expresses interest in the game, so they can just get in and get started and feel good about it as quickly and easily as possible.
Yeah, agreed. And one of the other things is like this, a lot of what we've talked about just now is from when you're building up a new community around a new speed game that doesn't have a big following yet. But even when you're looking at major runs, like SM64 is like the quintessential example of like huge game. How do you get started learning that run? Well, you can watch the world record and I guess try to imitate it, but you're going to hit a brick wall pretty quickly because you're not going to be doing the route that is accessible for new runners. And so even when your community is huge, having a route guide or some kind of resource accessible to people, and like what you said about accessibility is like a really big factor here, is like making things accessible like that is the way that you bring in new people into a community, even when that community is already thousands strong. Like, you still want to be able to bring in new people all the time, because speedrunning is a bit of a revolving door and people cycle out and new ones come in, and you don't want your community to have more filtering out than are coming in. So
yeah. Actually, since you mentioned issues from watching a world record video, that's actually something I added to this slide this morning because I'm commentating for Jitsuroku, the baseball game at the end of Silly Block, and I learned the run from watching Sean's world record. And this morning we were like practicing comms and going through the run and whatever, and he did something different. And I'm like, oh, did you change the strat there? And he's like, no, I just messed up in my world record VOD. And I'm like, oh, I thought you did that strafe for the animation cancel. And he's like, no, I did that strafe because I'm bad. So.
And how would you know that?
You
because
never
they're not
would.
going to say it.
it's
either.
not true. Every single world record's perfect in every way all the time. There's no world records with any mistakes ever.
Yeah, no one's ever set a record on stream and immediately said that was a bad run.
Yeah, you've never heard that once in your
Speedrunners
life.
famously
There's
love their speedruns.
There's also this concept, I think, of like, and everybody's been touching on it, of like, the most fragile moment in your speed running of a game is the moment that you start. That is the
Absolutely.
most fragile, tenuous moment. You do not
Absolutely.
have the sunk cost fallacy of having hundreds of hours in this game already. You're not like, okay, you know what, I really should just get better. I've already been doing this for long enough. Like, it's fine, I'll just do it again. Your first and second runs are your most fragile moments to decide if you want to do something, and those are the most crucial points to reach somebody at.
Yeah.
And having these guides available just brings more people into your community, brings more people who said, I had a good time with this guide. I'm going to tell my friends to do it. It was really easy to learn. There's this huge word of mouth thing that comes from that as well.
Absolutely.
And there's something, I mean, if you want your community to live and survive, and we see these communities for these games that have been out 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and still have thriving speedrun communities, is because people have learned it and loved it and brought other people in.
Yeah.
And you can't stress that enough. If you want your community to survive, that's what you do.
Absolutely.
And something else I
Absolutely.
can throw out on that is just the historical aspect, because every new route, every new iteration of how a game develops, if you're teaching it to someone, it means down the line it becomes a historical or archival resource. And partially that's good just to preserve how a community looks at a moment in time. And partially it's good because oftentimes as speedruns develop, they get harder. They get more brutal. And so again, when you're looking at people's first experiences in runs, being able to fish out the route from 10 years ago, from 6 months ago, from a week ago, before whatever the barrier skip equivalent in your game was found, is huge for being able to help someone just play the game again, but faster.
Yeah.
Also,
absolutely.
for the benefit of the fact that it will be nice to have all of those things compiled when Tomato Anus inevitably makes a video of your speedrun.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're just
always
giving him
happen.
material.
So hopefully we have sold you on why you should do this, even though it is a bit of work, but it's super worth it, I promise. Also, everyone laugh at my resources joke with the minerals.
I was
Ha
wondering
ha ha
about
ha
Ha
ha.
ha ha ha.
Thanks.
You.
I used to be a StarCraft no life. So types of resources, right? Because there are a lot of different things you can do, and not every resource is going to be valuable for every game in every situation. So obviously the first thing you probably think of is full run guides, right? Like just a PDF route document that walks you through what to do in what order, maybe has some maps in there, or a tutorial video, right? Those are probably the two most common resources we see. I'll just go through this whole slide and then we can wax poetic. I think that's the easiest way to do it. You also have options for specific tech, right? Like if your game has tricks and skips that are particularly difficult to figure out or take a specific setup, you may want to like just have somewhere people can look up all the different tricks. You might need a video to show like, hey, here's how you line this up, or like a diagram that shows like, you know, if the arrow's here and on this pixel, then that's great. Tech dictionaries and glossaries can also be really, really valuable if you have a game like Celeste where you have 20,000 different types of tricks.
Yeah.
Having just one centralized place where someone can go and be like, what's an ultra? What's a hyper? What's a super? What's a ultra hyper super? Like, having that all in one place is really, really valuable for new runners to always know, like, oh, I heard a word I don't know. I know where to find the information. And we'll talk a little later about maps and diagrams more, but maps and diagrams, I think, are underrated in resource creation. Like, we see a lot of text guides, but not as much, like, diagram use, which I love diagrams. Other things that we talked about, if one of y'all wants to talk about standardizing split names, because I know y'all are very passionate about this.
Yes, this is my bag. There are a lot of little things that people who have been running a game for a long time don't realize aren't common knowledge. I think there's a now basically famous XKCD comic about like, well, if you're not a geologist, you only know, and then they list like some hyper specific thing. We'll find it. But glossaries and standardized split names that explain exactly what is going on for the purposes of runners getting into the games, like being able to hand someone a live split file that says, here is exactly where you are going, here is exactly what the tech that is supporting you speedrun is doing, is huge. It also naturally lends itself towards development for entrenched runners, because that's how you get things like comsops, like community sum of best, as you agree on what the standardized splits should be for your run. And so it is a beautiful moment where you can align the interests of new runners and top level runners alike.
Yeah, one of the big issues that a lot of like even older games suffer from this issue, but like if I remember somebody, I'm not gonna say who, but I remember somebody on stream one time said, meme split names create a high degree of inaccessibility, which is true to a degree, but if you make standardized split names and standardized split times accessible to everybody, like chapter 1 blank, and you don't add memes to it, you actually make it more accessible. And I was thinking back to like what was that show on Hotfix that of like the world record review where they play their world record video and talk through it.
Victory Lap?
Victory Lap, thank you.
Yeah.
So there was like
Thank you, Jeopardy.
There was a few episodes of Victory Lap where they actually would blur out the runners' split names because there was like
Things.
colorful language in them, let's say. And it's like, yeah, if you want to do that for yourself, that's fine. But then if that's the only way that new runners have access to splits, then that's going to cause a huge accessibility issue because they're not going to know what, F word skip is.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so to summarize, do whatever you want with your splits, but please also have community splits so new people can know what's happening.
And standardized split times is huge for that, because if you don't have standardized split times, you cannot create a community sum of best. And depending on how big your game grows, that's going to become very necessary somewhere down the line. Obviously, if you have 3 people running your game, it's not a big deal, but when you get 50, you kind of want to have a community sum of best so you get a good sense of where the run is in terms of its historical trajectory.
Yeah. Absolutely. We also just want to touch on some resources that are kind of outside the scope of this panel. Like, we don't have time to talk about them, but we will talk at the end about where you can find information about them. Things like load removers, auto splitters, debug tools, right? Like those more tech-heavy resources. There are tools out there, and we will touch on them very briefly, but we would need many more hours to talk about how to build an auto splitter.
That's not the panel for this.
Yeah, trainers, things like that,
Yeah. Are they great? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
However, so some general tips. We ended up separating these into sort of the order you should do them for the most part, except for defining things, which kind of happens throughout. But first, you want to just identify what you need, right? What resources are actually valuable for your game. Because not every game needs every kind of resource, right? Like, one of the examples we'll look at is a route guide for Final Fantasy VIII, which has like one of the best 150-page PDFs in all of speedrunning. It is an incredible route guide that is so easy to follow as you're doing the run to learn it. It's amazing. That doesn't work for every kind of game, right? Like, some games move too fast for that. Some games have too many like decision trees and pain points to just go step by step through it, right? So a JRPG like that, fantastic candidate for a big old PDF. Turnip Boy, the twin stick roguelite with like 30 different decision trees every time something happens, not so much a good candidate for scrolling through a PDF. Does someone want to talk about planning before you write?
I don't think you need 150 pages for Turnip Boy anyway.
God, I hope not.
But yeah, so planning guides is kind of the tricky part, and it sort of works in tandem with identifying what's necessary for your game. Like, if you're running a 2D platformer, you probably don't need a 150-page guide, because there's not going to be that much to talk about. And also,
Go right.
Yeah.
Go
God,
left.
and then you get issues. Well, we'll get to that when we get to define things, because there's examples to pull from for that. But knowing how to kind of split everything out in terms of like your guide is really helpful. Like, when I was making tutorial for Doom 2016 100%, that game's really simple because there's 13 separate individual levels. Well, real easy. Make one video per level, and each video is like 20 minutes long, because that's a long run. It's a little over 2 hours without loads. It's like 2.5 with loads, so it's going to be like a 9-10 hour tutorial. And knowing where to kind of divide things up, like, it wouldn't make sense to talk about, oh yeah, I'm going to do this thing here in level 2, and this is going to affect something later on in level 9. That's not going to be very helpful. So knowing where to talk about, like, this skip versus this thing versus this thing versus this thing, it's kind of like prepping a GDQ run. Like, you know, knowing where to talk about certain tech. Like, you may not want to talk about this glitch or explanation now, because there's 10 other things going on that need a little bit more priority, and then you can talk about this later on when you do this in another level later, like down the line. And so knowing where to talk about different things is extremely helpful. The thing that you just want to kind of keep in mind is the more thorough you are, the better. And it's better to be too thorough than not thorough enough, because if you're not thorough enough, people are going to go into the Discord and start saying, I'm having trouble with this skip or this setup. Like, I'm thinking back to one friend of mine who went into, I don't remember which game it was exactly, but he went in and said, I'm trying to do this skip and I can't seem to get the setup. And the world record holder said, just watch the world record and copy that. Oh, well, thank you. That's so helpful. Like,
I never considered that.
Like, I never considered it. Like, it's like, obviously he's trying to do that and he's not having success. Like, you gotta have a little bit more thoroughness to the explanation. And that's one of the big problems that we found with a lot of resources that are out there right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing we talk about in comm world. I mean, we both teach like basic communication course, and like being audience centered is probably the thing I annoy students the most by saying 20,000 times.
Yep.
And it is just as true here, right? Like, consider what this is going to feel like as a brand new runner playing through this route for the first time, and where are you going to run into problems, which is why, to jump ahead a bit, revise is a really big step in this, of like, you're going to get feedback from runners. and these are all living documents that are going to change, right? Because you will make a document that you think rules, and it's like the best route guide ever. For example, the FF8 guide, which is a really, really good guide. The first time I used it, I spent like 5 minutes in a room because Awesome Waves accidentally said left instead of right. And it was one of those, pre-rendered FF8 backgrounds where like it's hard to see where you're supposed to go at the very back of the room, and it's like walk to the back, then go left. And I was like, well, obviously I'm just not getting the angle right, so I just kept trying to go left. And then eventually I was like, all right, I'll just try it. And I walk right and go right in the next room.
That's a wall.
Yeah, it was just a wall. So revisions are going to happen, not only because of little mistakes like that, but just things that don't quite make sense to new runners. And so you should always try to think while you're writing about what this is going to be like for someone who's new, and what language you need to define for them and what you need to explain to them, not necessarily what you need to do the run, because ostensibly you know the run by now.
Yeah, and to sort of jump off of that with there are even things you think you didn't need to define.
Yeah.
I'm in several communities that lean on portmanteaus like they are their second language. Every time someone tries to explain what a casusted fooper is, Maddie Thorson runs her nails along a chalkboard somewhere.
What is
A what?
that?
Cassette boosted fake super or feather super. I think both are valid.
Wow.
I
That
think.
wasn't-
Don't quote me on that.
That wasn't just things you made up for
Exactly.
the example.
Just spoke Latin randomly
yeah.
and summoned the demon.
Exactly.
And that's
for-
why Celeste has a glossary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or for another
Exactly.
example, there's an enemy in Death's Door that the community has nicknamed a Lickitung, a reference which is patently obvious if you've played a Pokemon game and entirely incomprehensible if you haven't. And so being able to really get into the weeds and glossary, even if it's just something that's like, hey, if you're ever confused, here's a plain text paste bin that has all of these things. I myself am incredibly guilty of attempting to name a trick in every speedrun that I play, a BLJ, because I think it's
You
hilarious.
even got me to name a trick that in a game you don't run.
Guilty as charged.
I
But-
think that's going to be the takeaway from this panel is to go do that.
Exactly. I mean, please, as a personal favor to me. But being able to just minimize the chafing. And you want to talk about, we've talked a little bit about left versus right, but do you want to talk about isometric left?
Oh gosh. Okay, so I know I said that I don't actually write guides, but at the same time I've been involved in a couple of them, and one of the ones is actually the Sexy Brutale. And if you're playing an isometric game and you tell somebody to go right, but there's two right side doors because there's one over here on this side of the square and one over here on this side of the square, you have to define which of the right doors you're talking about, because they are both equally on the right side of your screen. Just because it's like, well, it's your right from where you walked in from. If somebody is reading this guide and trying to play at the same time, they're not going to think about it like that. Like, they're not going to
Cardinal
think about it the
directions are your
same.
friend here.
Yeah, like cardinal directions, or in the case of like an isometric game, or like if you're really having trouble with it, give people an orientation in your guide. Like the things that you take for granted just because you're running it. Think about the time that you ran somebody through it. Sorry, Happy, who I ran through Sexy Brutale, and told to go left, and it was exactly right. It was directly opposite, and we had to change that live.
If I had a
during
nickel for
stream.
every time someone's told me to go left when I needed to go right.
And it was those exact directions too, because I remember what room it was. So yeah, just when you're looking at like isometric stuff, seriously, those orientations are major. I know in FF8, specifically, having literal imagery for where things go is unbelievably important, because it looks like left from this angle, but when you rotate the camera to put something else somewhere, just kidding.
And actually, going back to living things, another reason why these routes need to be updated sometimes is routes change. New stuff gets discovered. And I mean, like, we talk about Final Fantasy VIII. Really, it's every Final Fantasy. Every Final Fantasy game has, like, extremely comprehensive guides. And I remember Asuka was learning Final Fantasy Type 0, a game that's 20 years old, something like that. And while she was learning it, the route changed.
Yeah.
While, like, a 20-year-old game. So, like, routes
Yeah.
constantly get updated, and they need to be... You need to be a little bit flexible with them. And I know it's a lot of work, like we talked about. Like, making guides is so much work, but it is the way that you create accessibility, and you have to be kind of willing to change them as you go, as things change and get updated and get faster and harder and more complicated. And
Yeah. So, armed with an idea of what types of resources exist and general ideas of how you might make them, a more complicated conversation to have is figuring out what the heck your game needs.
Yeah.
It depends, is the short answer.
Yeah.
But some general ideas and tips that we kind of discussed as we've been prepping this. Ooh, nice. Sorry. Pop. So a full run guide, almost always useful, asterisks, but the format is going to be very dependent on the game, right? We talked about this a little bit with like a big long PDF is great for a JRPG, but not so much for like a shmup, right? Like they just need different things. You may also, and I'm going to throw this to Dane because I think you brought up different categories, but you may also want different types of guides for different categories even within the same game.
Yeah, and I mean, you could make a case for every category needs a different guide. Like even subcategory splits sometimes need different guides. Like what if you're running any % restricted versus unrestricted? Well, you're going to have a very different rule set depending on the game. You're going to have a very different rule set and a very different set of expectations for how that is going to be executed and difficulty level. And so being able to create a guide for one subcategory versus another one, like you kind of do need to make separate guides for each one. You can't necessarily, I mean, some resources, yes, will roll over. Like you might have a level that's exactly the same in restricted and unrestricted, but obviously the categories are being split because they're different, and because they're different, they're going to need different expectations.
Yeah, I think the example we talked about yesterday, because it's always a good example, was Celeste. Because like for Celeste, any %, there's really not a lot of value to a static map. Right, like just an image of a map is not going to do much for you.
Yeah.
Like different tricks and movement videos are really useful, but for the most part, any % in a platformer like that is get to end of room, right? And then obviously with Celeste, there's a ton of like, okay, do like jump off the wall here, do a super, do a hyper, whatever. But it's ultimately get to end of room, which doesn't require a lot of maps. But something like Red Berries might require some more maps because there's some that are hidden and you might want a screenshot to be like, hey, it's down over here. Or there may be multiple exits to a room and you need to explain like, hey, take this one first, go get the berry, then come back and go out the other exit. So the same game can need very different resources for different categories. If you don't make a full route guide, or even if you do and want to do other stuff, it can also be really valuable to have specific guides for specific tech, particularly like tricks that are consistently confusing. I think this is a good example of like letting things be a living document, listening to your new runners, listening to your community. If every single person trying to learn your game comes into the Discord and is like, how the heck does this trick work? I cannot figure it out. That's a really good candidate for just making a video.
Yeah.
Because it does feel good, both as a runner and as like someone learning a game. It feels super good when you just hop in the Discord and you're like, hey, I'm having trouble with this trick, and someone drops a YouTube link. Like with Death's Door, Pothead Skip had a YouTube video that was made soon before I learned it, which is like one of the only kind of like, oh, we break the geometry kind of skips in Restricted. And it was just so nice to hop in and be like, hey, watching the video, I cannot figure out how to get on top of this geometry. And someone was like, great, here's a YouTube video. It's 3 minutes long, and then I could do it consistently. You know, it really is worth making those little resources, because those are probably the things people are going to use most often throughout the course of the game.
Yeah, another really good example for this is Quake. Quake is not a long run. It's at the top level 12 minutes, give or take. But you are going to be doing bunny hopping through the entire run. That is like the core movement mechanic. And I remember when I went to go learn that run, there was a whole game tutorial from start to finish that said, this is going to be the route, this is the hard way to do it, this is the easy way, start with this, do this later when you get good at it. And at the very beginning of the video, the guy said, you're going to do bunny hopping. I'm not talking about that here. Go watch this other video instead, because they're going to talk about it here. It's like when you have a core mechanic like that, or a core piece of speed tech, videos specific to how to execute that, because Quake bunny hopping is hard. It took a long time to learn how to do that. And so making videos, it doesn't even have to be long. 2.5 minute video taught me bunny hopping, and then I just had to sit and grind it out till it clicked. And so you don't have to spend a lot of time working on these resources, but having them accessible is hugely helpful for new runners, because I would never have pounded that run down as much as I did if not for having a video that showed me here's how to do bunny hopping, here's how to hold the keys when you're swinging the mouse one side or the other.
And I think that's really valuable for setting expectations for new runners, right? Like, you're more likely to give up on a run if you open a video and they're like, okay, we're going to bunny hop the whole time. Here's a rough outline of how you bunny hop. And then you are struggling with it, but the route guide sort of suggested, like, oh, it's just this thing we do. Then you're like, okay, why am I struggling so much with this? This sucks. And it's easy to get, like, frustrated and burnt out by that. Versus if you create a separate video that is like, here's a detailed guide on how to bunny hop, because it's important and kind of hard, people will grind out a difficult skill if you tell them it's difficult.
Yeah.
But if people are
You're
surprised
setting
by the difficulty,
expectations.
yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. One of y'all want to talk about dictionaries?
I think probably
This was
Quack.
kinda-
Probably
yeah.
Quack.
Sure.
Yeah.
Tech dictionaries. So, as established, lots of acronym cleanup, lots of sort of what literally is going on, but also it goes back to clip collecting and that sort of thing. I think a couple of important things are, we talked about how you don't have to be God's gift to presentation in order to make resources. Summoning Salt intro music is amazing, but is not strictly necessary to teach a new runner how to execute something. But generally just making sure that it follows the course of a run. I think, learn from new runners is bold for a reason. The more you can interact with people coming into the game and get a sense of what they are struggling with and also how they learn a run. Oftentimes, as fun as the other categories are in your game, new runners are going to start with any percent, or if not any percent, whatever the most popular category on the boards are. They do that for a reason, right? Like, there is hopefully a bigger community around that. There are hopefully more resources around that. They're gravitating towards that sort of thing. When it comes to dictionaries, I like to try and make sure that tech explanations are laid out along the path of a run. I run a lot of Metroidvania games, right? And so there are a lot of specific skips. I think of like the shade skip in Hollow Knight, right? The sort of foundational tech. There are conservatively 75 variations of it that exist for slightly different categories, but being able to put like, hey, at this point in the route, you're going to do the shade skip. We call this the any percent shade skip. Here is a clip in a permanently hosted place that tells you what it is and how it looks for this route so that you can keep learning any percent.
Piggybacking off that, don't use streamable. Sorry, I have opinions on that one. Anyways, you want to take one?
Can I jump in really quick and say another like really good supplemental resource that doesn't necessarily have to be a full guide, but is really, really good for accessibility, is trying to make guides or short little pieces that help people circumvent the inevitable process of memorizing something is really, really important, because when you're starting a run, you're not going to have it memorized. I'm sorry. That's literally just how your brain works. It's not going to happen. And memorizing should not be a requirement per se, especially when you're learning. You're already trying to learn so many other things. The least you can do is make it so that it's accessible for someone.
Yeah.
So like for Warned, which is a game that I do run, we have a literal Google sheet, that like an Excel spreadsheet, that you punch in the two Magi's names that you're down to, and all it does is it spits back at you the differences between the two Magi so that you know what evidence to look for. And it immediately allows you to push for that evidence instead of opening up the book in the game, reading two things and going, okay, what's the difference here? And yeah, when you've done it enough, you'll eventually kind of memorize it or get a feel for it potentially, but that shouldn't preclude you from running it. And it honestly still shouldn't preclude you from getting a pretty reasonable time when you're learning. So anything that you can do to help somebody not have to memorize something, I think is also really approachable.
I run Rage. I've been running Rage for 2 years. I still use my splits as the route guide.
Yeah.
Like because every time I go back to Wellspring, I have to talk to different NPCs in different order, and the number of times I've walked into the sheriff's office and he's not there because I went shopkeeper. You're even 2 years on, I'm still running into that issue. So having those things accessible to yourself, even for stuff like that, for like the lack of ability to memorize stuff in some cases is also really helpful.
Absolutely. Dane, do you also want to talk about categories? So I know you're very passionate about that.
Yeah, so when we talk about category glossaries, one of this is getting a little bit into like leaderboard moderation more than like resource creation, but one of the most frustrating things is when I boot up like when I open up a speedrun.com page and I look at the category rules and it just says, you know, timer starts on blank, timer ends on blank, and I go, I don't know what's the rule here. Like if it's any percent, it's obvious. It's get to the end of the game as quick as possible. But like the example that I use is Doom 2016, Red Guard. Raise your hand if you know what Red Guard is. Exactly. Nobody knows what that is. One of the first things that I did when I proposed that category was explain what the heck this means. And so we went in and wrote Red Guard is all Praetor tokens. Collect every Praetor token in every level. Doesn't have to be in order. Doesn't have to be even in the same level. You can go to another level and come back, but you have to collect all Praetor tokens. Nobody that's looking that up is going to go, I don't know what Red Guard is, you know? Yeah. So defining categories really clearly is like extremely important for new runners. Even outside of like the resource creation scope of things, it's just like if you boot up Ocarina of Time is the best example of this because there's 10 billion categories under the meme board for Ocarina of Time, and I remember looking at blue percent and going, I have questions, and opened it up and it said collect all blue items, Ocarina, Nehru's Wind, etc., etc., and I was like, okay, I now know exactly what that is. So having that is so super, super important, especially when the category itself may not be actually clear initially.
And even something like 100% may not be clear. We learned
2
days before the Turnip Boy Commits Tax Evasion run at SGDQ 2022, we were in the practice room, and Eldritch Wolfie, who was running the game, is like, oh, by the way, did you know we don't have to get this item for Hundo? And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, this doesn't count toward our total, so the route doesn't include this item anymore, right? And so like 100% seems intuitive, right? Like get all the stuff. But some games might do, you have to have 100% show on the final screen, and some other games may do, here's the list of things that we consider 100% because there's no actual in-game counter, or the game doesn't provide us like the option to actually collect everything on one run or whatever it may be, right? So even something as intuitive to us as speedrunners as like any percent and Hundo may not actually be that intuitive to someone who's new. So it's still worth defining.
Also, looking at like something like Grand Theft Auto 5, you only need 50 out of 100 unique jumps for 100%. You don't actually have to do all of them.
Really?
So, that is one of the most bizarre things about that game, that you don't have to do all unique jumps. You just need 50 of them and you get 100%. So like having something like that is also important because even with games that have in-game trackers is like,
The one somewhat technical guide that we think kind of falls under the scope of this panel, I'll let Quack talk about, downpatching.
Downpatching, my absolute nemesis. It is an unfortunate fact of life in this day and age that games get patched all the time. Just recently I read a patch note that explicitly said, took out this trick to foment unrest in the speedrunning community, smiley face.
I love downpatching.
I love downpatching. I don't actually love downpatching. I wish every game could simply exist on current patch forever, but it is not the case. If you play games through Steam, like I often do, there are relatively arcane but at least explicable ways to get people to downpatch that have fairly generic advice for going in through Steam console, that you just need a couple of specific numbers for your game. For things like Switch games, for things like other launchers, it can be a little bit more arcane.
Good luck!
It sucks. I am a big proponent of separating out leaderboards for current patch or whatever is going to let runners play the game that they played casually, but that's slightly skew of this panel. Making sure that people who want to go for those top times by any means necessary, making sure they have access to the patch, the peripherals, anything they're going to need in order to be able to compete at that level is hugely important.
Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously load removers, auto splitters, trainers, etc. They're great. They're almost always useful. We don't have that much time. And then, because I should just say it on every slide, learn from new runners. this is both true in revising a resource and in creating new resources, right? Like if you have a lot of runners come in and be like, hey, is there a video for this trick? Is there a video for this trick? And there's not, maybe
If
just make
everyone's
one.
asking, you need it.
Yeah. If everyone wants it, just make it.
I got a good story about that one. I was learning turnip because I ran turnip the first Turnip Boy game, and so when the second one came out, I was like, all right, I'm gonna learn this one too because anthology. And I started trying to route it out, and someone, I think it was Irar, the super mod for it, was in chat watching and was going, I'm trying not to tell you where to go because you might figure out something that we haven't figured out yet. And like you can learn a lot from new runners. Like how many times does a casual player go into the speedrun Discord and go, how come you do it that way? Why don't you just do this instead? And there's like it's like a 5-minute time save or something.
I mean, I feel like the obvious famous example is the Metal Gear Solid.
Oh yeah, Boba Skip.
Kevin?
Kevin. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah. That like a casual streamer found a major skip that the community had been looking for years.
Yes.
Yep.
And everyone was just like, oh my god, you broke the game wide open. And then of course the joke is that they were like, well, we have to name the skip after you. What do you want us to name it? And they were like, I don't know, Kevin.
Yep.
So now there's like a huge skip in Metal Gear called Kevin.
I think they just call it Boba Skip now.
Yeah.
But
Boba Skip. Yeah.
I think a quick honorable mention of like tech and stuff like that we didn't necessarily touch on, and I just want to give a shout out to is specifically Rayman Legends. A lot of their movement tech is literally named after the buttons you were hitting.
yeah.
It cannot get more obvious than that when they're talking about the YYB and the YBY. Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
what buttons do I push to do this?
Actually, as a Switch Procon player, this is
We're not talking about you right now.
Push the X button. Is that the south, the west, or the north one?
Switch Pro Controller Evangelist Quack. This was the long con to get you all playing on Switch Pro Con.
Don't do it.
I play on Steam. I can't.
So yeah, let's very briefly before some Q&A, just want to look at some of the examples we've mentioned and talk about some things they do well. So the first of these we have is the FF8 guide that we've mentioned a few times by Awesome Waves, who explicitly said, if I would be there, I would be on this panel, but I'm not flying overseas. And I said, reasonable. But Awesome Waves has made, I think, an ideal route for an RPG or a kind of slower paced game that you can read as you go. And one of the big things I think every game can take away from this is these section labels and color coding things,
Yep.
right? If it's a menu, there's a big green label at the top that says, it's menu time, baby. If you're switching party members, it's always this color. Like, everything is intuitive. If it's an elevator, it's yellow, because the elevator is the real final boss of FF8. God, I hit that elevator, right? And then the first thing after that glossary, what is this category? Perfect example of what we're talking about with category names are not always intuitive, right? Easy CM is just easy card mod. It's early card mod, but the easy version. And then a whole description of how we landed on it and why it exists, why you would do it, how to start doing it, and then tech that comes up throughout your run, right? We talked a lot about specific tricks, specific skips, but something like bunny hopping, or in the case of FF8, always running away when you're in a fight because it speeds up how much animation we have to sit through, basically. They do less stuff if they're busy running, and that saves time. Explain that up top, right? Because you don't want a runner to press start, and then the first thing they have to do is read this half of a page of how they have to flee in every battle, while they're also trying to start doing the route, right? You want to make sure they have that information up front of like, step one, you're gonna be doing this the whole time. Now go press start. Right, so you go through all of that kind of tech, all that stuff you're going to use all over the place. And then, before the route even starts, pain points. XATM092 is a huge pain point in the run. It is the first easiest place for FF8 runners, old and new, but especially new and especially me, to make mistakes and die. And
This
lose
is just
your
a
run
personal call
and
out
reset.
for happy about themselves this
Absolutely
entire time.
it is, right? And so if you know there's a spot in your run where a lot of runners are going to run into problems, put that before they press start so that they're prepped for it, they have the information they need, and they're ready to go. And then when it comes up in the route, they're like, oh, I've seen this before, I know what to do here. And it's so much easier than trying to explain a really complicated boss fight while the boss is attacking them, right? and then links to other resources, and then you press start. Right? And then the rest of the guide is fairly straightforward. It's just step by step through everything you have to do. It's got screenshots where you need screenshots, like, hey, once you get here, do the menu. You should get an encounter here. Here's what this boss looks like because it made the formatting better, right? The rest of the guide is fairly straightforward, but I think the place where this guide really excels that we can all draw from is what you do before the player starts a new game. We've talked about Celeste a lot. Does anyone want to talk about why their SRC page is a blessing?
Because everything is labeled clearly. And this is like one of the big organization things, is if you can open up the guides page on speedrun.com and immediately spot what... Speedrun.com actually helps out with this because they have a section for guides, a section for tools. But it's like being able to know exactly what you're clicking on immediately is insanely helpful. And I can't think of a better example than Celeste. Celeste really does this better than any other board I've seen, partially because they just have so many bodies being thrown at this issue. They've been able to solve everything, but they have everything so clearly labeled that you basically can't not know what you're clicking on beforehand, and you know exactly where to go to find out what you need. Like, how do I do this super hyper screwy skip or whatever it's called? You can find the guide in there on how to do that.
Yeah. And like we were talking about a bit, different kinds of routes, right? We have, 5 any% guides here. Well, one of them's visual cues and setups and such, but you have like the basic any%, and then beginner, intermediate, sub 50, somewhere between the two, and then advanced movement is a separate guide, right? So obviously not every game, one, needs this many options, or two, has the manpower to create this many options, but it is a good example of the value of, saving. I think Quack mentioned like saving the history of your route, because at some point what used to be your record route may become a very useful beginner route, to be like, hey, do you want to get a 115 very easily? Great, do this route. Do you want to grind for record? Here's the stuff you have to learn to transition from the beginner route to record route.
Or even like taking a route that's current now that 2 years from now becomes completely outdated, might become the basis for a legacy category that, like, somewhere down the line. Like, look at Portal. Portal had their any% run, and then that thing got split into pieces, and so they took that old any% route and made legacy out of it, and now legacy has its own category, and they would probably have struggled to get off the ground a bit more if not for the fact that they had those resources built already right there. Oh, you pulled it up.
Yeah.
Very nice.
You also may notice that SRC automatically organizes guides alphabetically. So if you put multiple things on SRC, numbers are your friend, because as far as I know, there's no way to change the order in your guides and resources tabs.
No.
So yeah, just putting 1, 2, 3, incredibly helpful. Because if I'm a new Portal runner and I click guides, I go, oh, I should probably open this first. And then it brings me straight to a doc, and I can find everything I need immediately, right?
So if you want people to read yours, start it with A.
Actually, I think you should use asterisks, and then it'll even go higher than that. And then you're rating yourself, so you can give yourself 5 stars.
That's true.
Yay. And then also just wanted to talk a bit about how to approach making videos, because Quack has some great single segment tutorial videos.
Yeah, so in the interest of time and to get to the Q&A, we'll hit this very briefly and then move on. But basically, the any% tutorial guide for Haiku the Robot. If you're not familiar, Haiku the Robot is an indie Metroidvania. It's a very short run, about 20 minutes, and all of the movement tech in it is incredibly layered. Like, there are a lot of things that you can be doing that save a little bit of time, but very little is strictly necessary. There are no barrier skips in Haiku the Robot. So the way the guide is laid out is it's a single-take Twitch guide. You don't have to be God's gift to presentation in order to make a guide, but laying out basic mechanics of the game and definitions. What is your healing resource? How exactly does pressing the heal button work in this game? Because Haiku has a resource where it takes your money to heal, except in certain weird situations. And like things that I like to think of it as would be in the game manual for the game if it was written by speedrunners, but are not like explicitly tech. I think also of games like, again, Celeste and also Super Mario Odyssey that have like, here is your speedrun movement guide. That's its own thing. Then a very basic beginner walkthrough of the route, assuming almost no tech familiarity or no desire to learn it. Just like, here is the places you go in the Metroidvania. Then it contains a full techless speedrun that is a guide that you can follow along to get a good time of here's what clean movement looks like without those tech. Then, arranged by the difficulty versus time save of each successive trick, here's what you add to your speedrun in order to shave off some seconds. It starts with a very easy cutscene skip that saves 10 to 15 seconds, that's easy to reproduce, has a little bit of risk but not much, and then you get slowly towards things like corner boosting, boss phase skips, all of the advanced tech. And so, again, following the new runners in your game as they run the game will help you identify how to set up your resources.
Yeah, I think there's something very valuable about remembering that if somebody wants to learn all the tech from the beginning, they'll
do it.
But if someone doesn't want to, and there's not an easier guide for them, they simply won't learn the game.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there is no reason not to have a beginner guide that then gets more difficult, because it's not like you're forcing anyone to use the beginner guide. If a beginner wants to just start at the hardest difficulty of route, cool, they can do that. No one's stopping them. One thing we wanted to touch on really quick, and then I'm going to throw it to JPEG for Q&A, is to the end of Quack saying you don't have to be God's gift to presentation or to art to create guides, this is one of the most important images that ever existed in Death's Door speedrunning, and it was made in 10 minutes in MS Paint.
But Happy, what does it show us?
You start here, and you follow the arrow, and then these arrows are where you shoot, and then you hit something here, and then you shoot something here too, and then you leave through this door.
Oh.
Yeah.
Is that Death's Door that you leave through?
No, though Death's Door is in the game. It is a actual door. But yeah, so it doesn't have to be as pretty as the FF8 EZCM guide, right? That thing is beautiful. But even a quick MS Paint diagram can be fundamentally time-saving for every runner in your community.
Mm-hmm. I think what you're trying to say, in summary on the last bit, is that Watch Out for Rolling Rocks 1/2 A press is a cinematic masterpiece, but it is not a good speedrun tutorial.
You're so real for that. Very, very quickly, because I forgot about this slide before I throw to you. Auto splitters, load removers, beyond our scope, but there is a speedrunning tool development Discord. They're very easy to find on Google if you just search for speedrunning tool development Discord. Pops right up. They have a commissions channel and help channels. So if you are tech savvy, you know some coding languages. There is an auto split language that's very intuitive if you already know other languages. So they will help you learn how to write your own auto splitters, or you can hop in commissions and say, I've got a community, we need an auto splitter. Who can make it and how much do you want? And people are very reasonable about pricing. No one's like, give me $5,000 for your auto splitter. People are chill. Just make sure.
ASLs are C++, right?
No, there is a dedicated ASL language, but I think it's built on the back of C++.
C++, yeah, okay.
Just obviously make sure you are setting people up for success by explaining to them what you need, what you expect, what your timeline is. Basic doing business best practices.
Okay, so here's the deal. I have questions prepared if we want to ask everybody, but I also want to make sure that the floor is opened in case y'all want to ask questions first, and then we can do the questions that I have if y'all don't have anything that you've come up on your own. So if anybody does have a question, I believe that microphone is set up. I cannot take it off the thing and run it to you, so you will have to go up to it. I'm very, very sorry. But yeah, if anybody has questions, you want to just raise your hand, call out. Okay, so in the back.
And we are the absolute authority on all of this
yeah,
stuff.
Absolutely.
So
we know exactly what we're talking about at all times.
Hi.
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 Cool.
Yeah.
I'm a speedrunner for Death's Door, actually, of all
Boo,
things.
terrible game.
I know. I make video guides for it occasionally, and I wanted to know if you had tips, because I'm not the most eloquent person, for how to clearly, concisely, and digestibly put information into a video guide.
Okay, so clearly and concisely taking something that you had, to say in a video and actually making it understandable and quick and palatable, because sometimes your explanation can take longer than the video can take.
Yeah, I think a lot of this boils down to writing a script ahead of time, like knowing, being able to kind of edit and revise. I mean, I teach communication, so this is my thing, is being able to kind of write your rough draft of it and then put it away for a while, come back later, or even better, hand it to somebody who's a
Yes.
new runner and ask, does this make any sense? And if they look at this and go, this is Latin, I don't know what you're saying here, then you know that you got to make some changes to it and be willing to, again, this goes back to the whole living document thing, be flexible, be prepared to change things as needed. And if you can prepare a script ahead of time, you can chop down some of those videos by half or so. So I would say that's probably like my number one advice. I don't know if y'all want to jump in with anything else.
Yeah, and also know what sort of resource making is good for you. If you do not feel like you can confidently speak for 2.5 hours in a single take setting, make individual tech tricks. Like, any way that gets the information out there and in the hands of new runners is a good way. So set yourself up for success, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, thanks for all the stuff you've already made for Death's Door.
Yeah.
I've used a lot of it.
Okay, do we have any other questions or? Okay. In that case, I am going to jump in with questions. Okay. Do you, all three of you, this is for everybody to answer, do you have a sense for the right time to make a guide? Do you think that that matters?
Yes. But you can't ever really know that. Like, okay, so if the game has been out for a week, actually, ACT is a good example of this. So Another Crab's Treasure came out
April 25th.
Thank you. And that's a game that has a speed run that's broken, would we say?
Slightly broken.
Slightly
yes.
broken. So if we had made a tutorial for that game a week after it come out, that whole thing would have been outdated almost immediately. So I would say probably the best time is once the run calms down a bit, once you're not finding new skips every couple of days. Like I think back to Prey 2017 is a good example of this, where the first iteration of that any percent run was an hour and a half. For those of you that don't know, it's now 5.5 minutes. Imagine making a tutorial for an hour and a half run only to find, and literally it went down from an hour and a half to I think 13 minutes in the span of a couple of 4 days.
Oh my
because
gosh.
they found goo clipping. If you don't know what that is, that's what the speedrun glossary is for that we talked about before.
Yeah.
That it was like if you made an hour and a half tutorial and then suddenly goo clipping got found, you've pissed away all this time. Granted, like it's still useful to have that material made available because that might be useful at some point for something else. But I would say that probably the best time is to wait until after the mad scramble of the initial release has calmed down a little bit. Otherwise, you're gonna have a bad time.
I
You're gonna
don't
be
think
doing
there's a
double work.
wrong time, but I think it's a question of what your free time is like. Like, the reason that I am a moderator for Haiku the Robot is because I made a new any percent guide once per day for the first 3 days that the game was out.
Are you okay?
It was before I had finished playing the game. I was just typing what other people said. She's not okay. She's not okay. But I got the SRC sword, and then I beat the game for the first time. Don't do that. That's bad. But it is a question of, like, what is your bandwidth for getting resources out? The earlier in a game's lifespan you're working on these things, the more likely it is that something's going to get found tomorrow. But sometimes that's what the people want.
Yeah.
And sometimes making these guides, even when you know they might be outdated pretty quickly, can sometimes be useful because I feel like I became a better runner after
Yes.
I made guides for
Yes.
things. Like I feel like I was a better runner for Fashion Police Squad after I made a tutorial for it. So like there's still value in making those things, even if it's just for yourself.
Yeah, and to the end of like not being worried about like getting it done right away, like we've all been a part of learning a game the first week it comes out. No one expects there to be a guide,
No.
right? No one's
Yeah.
coming in your Discord day 2 and like, yo, why is there no any percent guide? You're like, we don't even know what any percent is yet. Like, chill. So yeah, I do think there's a little down period where it's probably better to wait a little bit and let it settle. But like, I don't know, if you have infinite free time and want to, it can also be cool to have a historical record of what the first few days looked like. So I don't know, live your truth.
Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to ask the one that allows y'all to kind of hype yourselves up a little bit. Is there a guide or resource you have made that you're particularly proud of, or something that immediately comes to mind for you when you came to do this panel?
I made a silly little NeoCities website to house a lot of resources for indie games. It's called Time Save for Next. timesavefornext.neocities.org. I'm still building it out, but I hope to have a lot of indie game guides there so that people can plug and play a lot of games with like a dozen runners or fewer, and that's my jam.
And it's better than Discord.
And it's better than Discord.
yeah.
We cleared the low bar.
I would say for me it was Doom 2016 100% classic, just on the sheer ground of how long it took and that there was no other tutorial before that. Like 80% had 6 guides for it, because the 80% for that game is down to 17 minutes. That game, by the way, is like a 12-hour casual playthrough. It's down to 17 minutes. 100% had nothing. So I was like, well, there were people I knew were like, I will learn Hundo, but there's no guide for it, and it's a long run. There's a lot that goes into it. So having a guide for it, I was like, you know what? I have to prioritize this right now because we're literally going to lose new runners if we don't have this. So I would say that's probably my proudest one.
Yeah. Honestly, I feel like mine is one I haven't finished yet. I'm working on a route guide for Ikenfell, which is like an indie similar to a JRPG, and I've been able to kind of one-to-one with like Awesome Waves FF8 doc like organization, and it's been a really cool learning experience to take another game and approach it from that perspective of like, okay, for FF8, here's the 5 things you need to know before you press start. What's the equivalent in this other game? And I've learned so much about the game that way. And I just love this game, and I think it's super cute and nice and good and fun and deserves to have more runners. Because if you want, it can be a 5-hour RPG run, but also if you want, it can be a 6-minute glitch fest. And so there's options. No
pressure, but I will absolutely run Ikenfell once that guide exists.
So I'm super stoked about that. And it's very complex, so it's hard and taking a long time, but I'm very proud of the like 50% I've gotten done so far.
Awesome. We are now 3 minutes over estimate. So I think that probably wraps that up. If nobody has any more questions, thank you all so much for doing this and for allowing me to kind of be the random in the corner and ask you questions. I appreciate it.
Having a neophyte is extremely helpful for these sorts of things. So.
It's like we said that.
I am the person to test things against, I suppose. So.
Right.
Well, thank you all very much for
thank you all so much.
and
Really appreciate it.